A big welcome back to our listeners and viewers of the Responsible Edge podcast, brought to you by the Anti-Greenwash Charter. This week, I am absolutely thrilled and delighted to be joined by Clayton Hirst. Clayton, thank you so much for giving up some of your time this Thursday morning.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you, Charlie.
Now, Clayton, you and I met certainly last year. We're recording here on the 3rd of April, 2025, for those interested in knowing. And I've been really looking forward to this conversation. I think as somebody with your degree of experience and accrued knowledge, if you like, about all things corporate affairs and communications, I'm excited to get into this. I know your background. Some of our listeners and viewers will be aware of what you've done in your career, but for those that are not, please start wherever you like. Just give us a sort of a background and a story of your journey, if you like.
Right. Well, thanks, Charlie. So I'm not particularly used to talking about myself in this way, so please jump in if it's not working for you. But I was born in Huddersfield in West Yorkshire, which is, for those of you who don't know, is a mill town. Used to be one of the most prosperous towns in the country because it was all its economic success was based on the mills. There's a sort of a story that, and I think it's apocryphal, but there was apparently more Rolls-Royce dealers in Huddersfield in the sort of 50s and 60s than anywhere else in the UK. I don't think it's true, but I think it gives you a sense of just how powerful it was. But unfortunately, the industry went into rapid decline. So when I was growing up in the 1970s and 1980s, it was in decline, and it's not a particularly sort of economically prosperous town now. As a sort of child, I've always been sort of fascinated by sort of what's going on around me and sort of news and current affairs, which is quite interesting for a young child. And I remember probably one of my earliest memories actually was of the miners' strike, because Huddersfield sort of borders various different mining towns. And I remember my parents in the run-up to Christmas one year asking me me and my sister to collect up all our old toys, because there was a big sort of initiative to effectively collect toys and give them to the miners who were striking at the time to enable them to give to their children. So that was quite an early memory. I also have sort of strange memories of the Troubles and seeing it on television, as in the Troubles in Northern Ireland, because you may remember that at the time the BBC had this policy of not enabling members of the IRA to have their faces shown on TV or their voices being broadcast. So you had these sort of very strange sort of scrambled voices that were appearing on the news, but it sort of captured my imagination, as it were. And after studying, I went to university. So I studied environmental planning in Birmingham. So it was start off as the Birmingham Polytechnic, and it became a university when I was there. And environmental planning is sort of one of those great things that for people who don't really know what they want to do with their career, because it's sort of a mixture of urban design, law, all sorts of interesting things that relate to geography. And it was genuinely quite interesting. And I remember as well, when I was at university, going back during the summer to do summer jobs. And again, because it was Huddersfield in the north, and it was in the early 90s by this time, and the UK, and particularly the north, was in a deep recession. And my first, my job I had at the time was working in a textile mill as a sort of a very junior labourer. And it was really hard work. You know, I was being paid £1.10 an hour, and I was doing everything which you might consider to be a northern cliche. So I was quite literally at one point cleaning chimneys, so descaling boilers, and doing some pretty hard labour. And I remember it was so tough that one day I got out the sort of local equivalent of the Yellow Pages and rang up all the local businesses, desperate to try and get another job, but there was no employment at all. But I think the reason I sort of tell the story is that working in this sort of very hard labouring environment gave me a bit of a spark to say, actually work hard, you get a degree, and that'll give me a potential springboard into something that will be potentially more interesting. So, sorry, Charlie.
No, Clayton, it's absolutely brilliant. And you've already just given us, some absolutely brilliant kind of formative experiences and memories that you had. You mentioned environmental planning. Your decision to do environmental planning was based upon that sense that a lot of young people have of like, I'm not quite sure what direction I'm going to be heading in here. You obviously had been inspired as a younger, as a child growing up to sort of be inspired by what you saw in the media, etc. But that hadn't quite kind of played out in terms of your decision about what you want to do at higher education. Having gone and had this experience in the mill and having toiled hard, if you like, for your £1.10 an hour, which seems amazing to sort of reflect back on. What impact did that have upon your going back to Birmingham and carrying on with your degree? Were you beginning to be much clearer in your mind about the direction you were going to take from that point on? Or did the rest of your degree still play out with I'm not quite sure what I want to do, I just know I don't want to be a labourer?
Yeah, I'd love to say it gave me this sort of big strategic insight into what I should do, but I didn't have a clue, really. I think my career has been sort of fairly unplanned, and I've gone and done things that I found interesting, and have a bit of purpose to them. But no, I didn't come away with this great insight into what I needed to do. Because actually, after I graduated with my degree, rather than going into the sort of profession of environmental planning or town planning, I actually became a journalist, which is quite a pivot. But my first entree into journalism was working on various trade magazines to do with the built environment and the property industry. So that gave me a bit of a route in. But I think the thread there is that I've always been interested in lots of different things. And journalism is a great way to get into that. So yeah, that's how I got into my sort of first phase of my career. I think my career's had sort of three main phases. The first phase was in journalism, first as a trade journalist, and then eventually I ended up as a deputy business editor on The Independent on Sunday for a decent slug of time. And that was when, The Independent was still a proper paper. You read it and you got your sort of inky fingers. It was a broadsheet. It was a very different era to how it is now. I'm sounding very old, but that's how it was. And I had a great experience working as a journalist.
And on that point, again, reflecting back upon, your experience of seeing the troubles in Northern Ireland, of your experience of seeing the impact of deindustrialization going on in the north, as you spoke about earlier. And that was obviously all through the media and your experience of that. And you said it captivated you. What was it like for you then actually being part of the media and contributing as a journalist? Like what was that experience? Did you feel like you had sort of found that thing that sort of resonated most closely with your sort of formative inspiration?
I absolutely loved it, Charlie. It was a sort of fantastic experience because being a journalist and also, funnily enough, being in communications, you get, by its nature, you get to get involved in the most interesting stuff. The stuff that's newsworthy, the stuff that sells newspapers, the stuff that people want to talk about. So yeah, it was a fantastic experience, and it sort of fueled my interest in all sorts of things to do with news and current affairs. I was principally a business journalist, but what I sort of specialize in is that sort of intersection between business and policy and politics. I covered lots of interesting things, but working on The Independent and The Independent on Sunday, it was a sort of, at the time, it was a relatively lightly staffed newspaper. So, I covered all sorts of extraordinary things. And probably the most memorable thing, memorable for sort of right and wrong reasons, was 9/11. So I remember being in the newsroom, and this was we had a big office in Docklands, had screens all around the newsroom, and we had sort of Sky News playing, and we almost saw, the 9/11 attacks happening in real time. And that moment was a sort of real pivotal moment in journalism, but also obviously in the sort of world history. And then for the next year and a bit, really, it was everything we covered. And it was an extraordinary time to be a journalist. Both, it was sort of a heady experience because there was the horror of it, but also being a journalist, it's a strange thing to say, but it was very adrenaline fueled because you were at the center of reporting on, an extraordinary world event that really did change the world forever.
And Clayton, I feel like there's a whole nother podcast on your sort of sort of takeaways, if you like. You mentioned the fact that it changed journalism and it changed the world. I'd be fascinated to pry into that perhaps in another show. But just talk us through. So you mentioned that we've got 3 stages of your career. You've had this first stage working as a journalist, as you say, kind of the sense I got is that you obviously had a very curious mind, kind of, you were a curious young man growing up, and you almost through the journalism experience that you had an opportunity to sort of build your career and be paid to be curious and to be interested in things, which is a wonderful experience to perhaps go through. You've alluded to. What happens next? What's the second stage?
Yeah, well, the second stage is going into communications, and I spent a very happy decade working at Ofcom, which is the media and telecoms regulator. Did various roles, but eventually became director of comms there. And again, I was there at such an exciting and interesting time. So I joined before the iPhone was even invented. I joined when there was a huge debate going on in politics and in media and in the industry about the convergence of media and telecommunications. And effectively, Ofcom was created on this vision, and it was a very big vision that these industries would converge. And we covered all sorts of interesting issues and developments when I was there. So we handled the mobile 4G auction, which was raised billions of pounds for the exchequer. We did a huge amount of work to effectively bring in competition into the telecommunications sector in this sort of process. It's quite nerdy now, but called local loop unbundling, which was effectively to say, let's break BT's monopoly and let other companies come in and offer services. And then probably one of the most intense periods of time, but again, it was very exciting, was investigating the Murdoch empire. On the back of all the phone hacking revelations. So we had to determine whether the Murdochs were fit and proper to own the Sky TV license on the back of the Leveson inquiry and on the back of all the phone hacking allegations. And it was hugely polarizing. You can imagine the Murdoch press was very, very critical of Ofcom and attacking us quite considerably for doing this investigation. And then he had other sections of press saying we were being too weak on the Murdoch. So it put us right in the public eye at an extraordinary period of time. But doing communications and leading communications for the organization was, it was very, very exciting. I think we're going to talk about purpose in a few moments, but Ofcom had this really baked in purpose, and it was baked in because it was defined in the act that created Ofcom, which was to further the interests of citizens and consumers. And that was a thread that ran right through the organisation. Everything we were doing, we were thinking about how this is going to potentially benefit citizens and consumers of the UK.
And Clayton, that was beautifully described. And we'll, as you say, come on to talk specifically about purpose in a bit. I want to ask you, though, personally about pressure. You brilliantly described then the pressure that Ofcom was under, Leveson inquiry, etc., the Murdochs. How have you, throughout your career, and as you're growing, you've moved from the independent, you're now into this head of communications role at Ofcom. How are you managing pressure yourself? You mentioned there that it was exciting to be finding yourself, dealing with these issues or these big issues and leading on the comms side of things. But touch upon how you manage pressure yourself.
Yeah, it's a good question. And I don't really have a smart answer to that, Charlie. I've got personal things I do. I enjoy sort of countryside and cycling and stuff like that, which is a way of relieving pressure. I think also looking back at the periods of time when there was significant pressure, one of the beauties of it was working for Ofcom, for example, is that the people around me were real high caliber, top draw people. So we were under considerable pressure at periods of time, but I was working with some quite extraordinary people who I'm still in contact with today. So that sort of collective team spirit really did help with the pressure. And to give you another example of the pressure, sort of on the back of the sort of the whole Murdoch thing, before David Cameron became Prime Minister, he did what most Prime Ministers do, which is to call for a bonfire of the Quangos. Literally every single new prime minister comes in and talks about having a bonfire of the Quangos. And he went on TV and said that top of the pile of the bonfire should be Ofcom. So you can imagine the effect that had on the spirit and the on the organisation. But because we were such a high performing organisation, we were such delivering the goods, that when Cameron did come into power, the bonfire was sort of extinguished very quickly. And actually we were given more powers because under Cameron, then we were given the responsibility for regulating postal services, and responsibility over the BBC was extended. So it's a slightly long and winding answer to your question, Charlie, but it's the quality of the people around you which really does help, I think.
And it's fascinating to know that. And again, we're gonna I think sort of touch upon the experience of or the interrelationship between developing a really impactful successful culture and how that aligns with purpose in our second part of our conversation. But what struck me from what you've described there is that actually the pressure built the resilience and built the sense of we're strong in our convictions and in our culture and in our team, and bring it on. And anything that we can go through together will ultimately make us stronger, if I can borrow that horrible cliche. Clayton, let's move on to the third stage, if possible. Yep. If we're there, just talk us through the third stage in your career.
The third stage was a sort of more classic corporate comms career. So I did 3 roles as sort of head of corporate comms or head of corporate affairs. The first was working for Virgin Media. I joined at a really exciting time when Virgin was investing significant amount of money in its fibre optic broadband. So spending £3 billion wiring up an extra 4 million homes in the UK as a sort of real challenger to BT. And then I worked for the John Lewis Partnership, so very different type of business, an employee-owned business which owns the Waitrose supermarket stores and the John Lewis department stores. And I joined at a really interesting time. It was sort of right at the start of Brexit and the trade negotiations that were taking place. So a big part of my role, I was doing a lot of public affairs there, was to effectively engage with government on how the trade deal should look, and also working with the business to help them understand what the implications of the different trade deals might be. And then I left the John Lewis Partnership shortly after the beginning of COVID. So, again, as a retailer, COVID had this extraordinary impact on day-to-day operations. So had lots of very memorable discussions with number 10 of the Treasury. All of a sudden, their doors were open and they wanted to have direct engagement with businesses like ours about what should be done to effectively protect jobs and to protect industry. So I had some very direct conversations with them. I remember one day getting the train into Euston, and I jumped on one of the hire bikes, and my phone rang. So parked on my bike, picked up my mobile phone, and it was someone I'd been dealing with at the Treasury. And he said, "Right, I'm about to go into number 10. Tell me what I need to know." And that was, gives you an example of just how direct those conversations were at the time. So yeah, it was a really interesting period of time for us. I also had the pleasure, in inverted commas, of giving evidence at a select committee inquiry, which I can tell you, Charlie, in terms of the preparation and the pressure, blood in the heck, that was hard work, but I think I survived it okay.
And just to finish off, Clayton, your last, you're as we record, you're in between roles, aren't you? But just talk us through sort of the most immediate and what you're doing next.
Sure. So my last role before I start my new job was working for Halma. So Halma is a business that often people haven't heard of. It's a FTSE 100 company, and it's a global group of around 50 small companies all around the world that are in 3 main sectors. So safety, the environment, and healthcare. And Halma is a very sort of purposeful company. It's got a very strong purpose that binds all those companies together. And it's also very successful. So financially, it's an extremely successful business. And a big part of my role there has been using corporate communications and using Halma's purpose to sort of help drive future growth for the business. So yeah, it's a very exciting role. A big part of my job there was building a global team, a global comms team, which is doing an absolutely fantastic job. And as you say, I left Halma after 4 and a bit years this February, and I'm about to start a new role next month as we're recording. Another big sort of pivot for me. So I'm going to be joining the healthcare sector. So I'm going to be joining an organisation called St Andrew's Healthcare, which is a very large charity. It's been going on for 180 years, employs 4,000 people, and they specialise in complex mental health issues. So they're effectively trying to help the most vulnerable people in society recover from very significant mental health issues. And also, they're helping people who are vulnerable in society, and in a society which sometimes discriminates against people with these sort of conditions. So, I think there's a really big opportunity here to have a potential impact in a very important sector.
And Clayton, that was brilliantly described. And by the way, for any of our listeners and viewers that want to go, we're going to obviously link to Clayton's LinkedIn profile and all the various organizations that he's mentioned. So you guys will be able to sort of check out the full timeline of events, if you like. But Clayton, I want to ask you, as we've kind of sort of mentioned a few times, we're going to be talking about purpose at a corporate level in a moment. But I just got a couple of questions for you on your personal purpose before we move forward with that. You mentioned this pivot into healthcare. What was it in particular that attracted you to making that decision to join St Andrews? What was it again, the opportunity for, as you've alluded to, kind of greater impact or impact in an area that you haven't yet worked in? Or, I'm putting words in your mouth. What was it that attracted you?
I think it's two things, Charlie. It's curiosity, because it is a new sector that I haven't worked directly in. And like I said from the start, I'm just inherently curious about different things. And the beauty about working in corporate communications in journalism is that you can become a specialist in your field, but you can work it across different sectors and different industries. So that's definitely one thing. But the bigger driving force for me is to use the skills and experience I've amassed and use that for an organization that's having a really direct impact, positive impact, hopefully, on people's lives. And that's something I'm really keen to do, because I got to a bit of a crossroads when I left Halma. I could have done another big sort of corporate job with all the sort of the benefits that will deliver, or I could have gone down this other route. And it's just something I want to give it a go and try. It's and I know I would have regretted it if I hadn't have done that. So it's a bit of a sort of a fire in my belly at the moment.
I love that. And final question on you before, because I've got my producers, plaints ringing in my ear already. Yeah. I want to, you brilliantly described, and gone through your, all of these various experiences that you've had throughout your career. And actually, it's fascinating to even think about the significant, worldwide events that have kind of, been drawn throughout your career path and at different stages. I just want to take you back to the 20-something-year-old Clayton who's at Birmingham doing his environmental planning degree. What do you think the 20-something-year-old Clayton would make of what you've gone on to do in your career? What do you think he would say about what you've done?
Gosh, it's a great question. And I'm not, as you can probably tell, I'm not very reflective on my own career. And I never thought about that before. I think I will be quite intrigued, because I've put my nose into all sorts of interesting issues and sectors. And my career, thankfully, hasn't been boring. I've worked with some really interesting people and on some really interesting things. And I never really wanted a boring career. And I've been lucky in that respect. So, I think I would just be quite intrigued, actually.
I can imagine you would be. I think it's even just, as we say, with this little reflection that we've done this morning, I can see that there are some really, really fascinating points along a very, very interesting and in-depth career. One final question. I will leave it to this. One final question. It kind of lines with what you were mentioning around St Andrews and your decision to move there. But when you think about the rest of your career, what would success in throughout the rest of your career look like? Like what do you want to achieve with the rest of it?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think the thread that sort of has run through my career is wanting to work for organizations that I think are doing good in society and in the world. Because, corporate life can be a tough gig at times, and you want to be able to get out of bed in the morning and think that you're actually making a net positive impact on the world. So I think, to answer your question, whatever comes next will have to sort of fit into that area, and to enable me to continue to sort of work for organizations that I can support and I can do good in. I don't know whether that sort of answers your question or not, Charlie, but
you've nailed it, and you kind of alluded to it before, and which is why I think it's so refreshing, as you say, to see that you've made that decision that you have made about not going down the big corporate opportunity, if you like, that you could have picked up, but instead look to focus your energy and your skill set, if you like, into a new area that might have an even greater impact, I suppose, with what you're able to bring to the role. So yeah, we'll definitely be keeping a keen eye on what happens at St Andrews, moving forward. Right, 28 minutes into recording, we're now going to switch focus and look at this today's sort of theme. Now we're going to do some things slightly differently, as agreed to before the show, Clayton. Would you start? I think you suggested it might be worthwhile. We're going to be talking about corporate purpose today. For you to just provide a bit of a definition, a bit of an overview of what corporate purpose really is before we jump into this week's article by Brent Gleeson in Forbes. Would you mind just providing us with that overview of the issue?
Yeah, sure, Charlie. Because it's one of these things where there's loads and loads of books written about corporate purpose, but I think it's good to sort of try and boil it down to what it actually means, because I think it's relatively simple. So I think the first thing is that corporate purpose is a definition of the reason why the organization exists. And then from a sort of more positive perspective, it's the ambitions. So it's the problems that an organization is solving or the opportunities that they are creating. And inevitably, I think purpose leads to sort of long-term thinking about the sort of the big issues around people and planet. And therefore it becomes a sort of a North Star, or the strategy for the organization. And done well, organizations can take that purpose, and that can really define then the direction they're going in from a strategic perspective. And the reason why purpose has been sort of de rigueur for the last few years is that people have sort of figured out that it can have this sort of positive flywheel effect, that if you've got a strong purpose, which the strategy nets up to, that can have a positive impact on the performance of the business, which can in effect then generate greater profits that can be fed back and fuel the purpose. So it can create this sort of multiplier effect and have a really positive impact, not just for shareholders, but also for a much broader group of stakeholders. And often, purpose gets confused with other things. So I would say purpose is why the organization exists. An organization's mission is what the organization does, and then underpinning all that is the values, how the organization behaves. And before we get into the article, I think it's worth just saying what purpose isn't as well, because, it's great talking to you, Charlie, as someone who is a real champion for being sort of clear and honest in their communications. And I think at times purpose has been sort of taken by various industries and, let's say, stretched a little bit. So purpose isn't in itself marketing. It's not PR, although communications can support purpose. It's certainly not corporate social responsibility, because that's sort of not, I would say, core to the business. But again, it can fit in with the purpose of the business, but it's not CSR itself. And it's also not lefty. It's not woke. All these terms that have been attached to purpose recently by certain commentators. It's a proper business strategy that can help drive performance for the business. So I think that hopefully sets the scene a little bit, Charlie, about my thoughts on purpose anyway, but I'm sure other people will have different views as well.
Well, we would love to hear the different views and comments, etc., in various things, but I think you've absolutely nailed it. I haven't got my Forbes sort of definition in front of me, but I think you pretty much absolutely provided a brilliant synopsis. in light of that, then, and obviously we're going to be, touching upon a few interesting themes I know that you and I spoke about before the show's recording, but just the article by Brent Gleeson from September last year, I think, again, that's an interesting point to make, that this article was put together in September last year, considering when we're recording now. But what was it that, and again, we'll link to the article so others can go and really check it out. But from your perspective, Clayton, was there anything in particular that really struck you in that piece about corporate purpose?
Yeah, well, I think you're right in saying it was published in September, so it's sort of pre-Trump, and the world has changed quite a bit since Trump has become US president. But I think the article is a really good and solid description about the benefits of corporate purpose. As I say, there's been lots of books written, but sometimes the books lack a little bit of sort of brevity, should we say. And this is a really good way to sort of describe some of the benefits of corporate purpose. So the article, first and foremost, was written by a chap called Brent Gleeson. So he's a former Navy SEAL, and often you see these Navy SEALs going to sort of corporate leadership development. So he wrote the article. He also wrote a book a few years ago called Embrace the Suck, which is he's a US author, so I'm not quite sure it necessarily translates that well to the UK audience. But effectively, his point in this book, and it was quite sort of alpha male-y, I would say, is that you've got to lean into suffering, you've got to get comfortable with it to become a big corporate leader. But having said all that, his article actually is quite thoughtful, and what he does is he touches on three of the big benefits of corporate purpose. So the first one is employee engagement. And he uses some data published by Deloitte to show that engagement rates when employees are working for an organization that has a strong corporate purpose, their engagement levels go up. And that's because employees have a strong affinity and a sense of purpose about what their work is all about. And if I go off on a slight tangent, I'd just love to give you my favorite example of employee engagement when it comes to corporate purpose. You may have heard this already, but it's such a great example. During the sort of the moon landing mission, JFK was touring the NASA facility, and he came across a janitor or a cleaner who was doing his job. And JFK said to the cleaner, "So what do you do here?" And the cleaner turned around to JFK and says, "My job is to put man on the moon." And that's just such a great example of how that employee saw their role as something much bigger, a much higher purpose. And I think where there is an opportunity to do that and to really engage employees with the higher purpose in what they're doing in work.
And Clayton, just on that point and reflecting back upon the way that you described your experience at Ofcom, do you see commonalities in the fact that there was this very, very clear vision and purpose at the heart of what Ofcom was trying to do, and that then allowed you, as we alluded to before, to be more resilient through the more pressurized, difficult times? Does that align in terms of the way that people reacted, if you like, within Ofcom?
It really did, actually, Charlie. So as I say, at Ofcom, our purpose was to further the interests of citizens and consumers. There was a sort of second bit, which was by promoting competition, encouraging investment, innovation and growth. And within the organization, it was a subject of significant debate when we're thinking about different policy responses or how we were responding to different situations. And it was constantly in our dialogue and in our mind, even to the point where there was debates taking place about the difference between a citizen and a difference between a consumer, which may be getting into the realms of nerdiness, but what it does demonstrate is that people really did see and think about the purpose of that organization very, very deeply. And it did align then all our decisions and what we did around that sort of very strong purpose that was defined by lawmakers, but was the golden thread that ran through the organization.
And coming back to your point about that first kind of key outcome of getting purpose right, that ultimately the retention and the engagement of your people is a core outcome. Just run us through the others that you kind of picked out from the piece.
Yeah, sure. So the other 2 points, I think, or 3 points that he makes. The next one is that a strong purpose can drive innovation. So he has a statistic that, again, from Deloitte, that they identify that companies that have got a strong purpose see a 30% increase in innovation rates. And then he also draws on some research from McKinsey that says that purpose-led companies are 5 times more likely to deliver breakthrough innovations than companies that don't have a strong purpose. And I think the reason for that is very, very simple, that you hire and attract people who are motivated by that purpose. So therefore you can create a sort of entrepreneurial spirit to get people behind delivering these innovations. So I think he uses the data to make that point very, very clearly. And then he sort of brings it all together and talks about the financial benefit of a purpose. And there's lots of data out there that you can draw on, but he has this nice statistic that he shows that companies that are considered to have a strong purpose have an annual return on equity of 13.1%, which is apparently 9% higher than the average in the S&P. So it sort of helps to sort of make the point that, purpose helps to engage employees, it creates innovation. But again, when I was talking about that flywheel effect, it also generates significant returns, above average returns.
Clayton, let me ask you what might seem like a very silly question here, and I want to get on to talking about the kind of your observations around where we are with purpose. But why would any organization not, in light of this, choose to work or invest their time in developing and clarifying and implementing their corporate purpose? Is this you mentioned that within these studies they talked about organizations that lacked purpose? Why would any organization, knowing this now, not be working on this? Are they? Is it simply that they are?
I think it's a very good question. I think it is hard work, to define a purpose and to align the organization behind that purpose at the very highest level, at the board level, is hard work. And it can create some difficult decisions at times, and it will create some potential trade-offs. So it's not just a case of going away and coming up with a sort of nice slogan and attaching it to the top of the building. It has to run really deep in the organization. So it does require some significant level of leadership. And actually, the Brent Gleeson article touches on that he says that there's no point in having purpose unless you've got what he described as mission-driven leaders. And these are people, he says, work at every level of the organization who are laser-like focused on delivering on that purpose. So he says, you want to get all the benefits, great, but you have to have leaders in the organization who are really focused on that.
And does that really boil down to, Clayton, to oversimplify things, but ultimately making difficult decisions, as you alluded to? Like, it's that if you want to implement that purpose authentically, you're just going to have to make decisions that at time are going to be unpopular and difficult, and create a sort of a throwing up of the status quo and change within an organization, which is obviously particularly difficult at the sort of large macro scale. Is that what it boils down to?
It absolutely does. So if you're an organization, for example, who's sort of got an investment portfolio, you're going to have to make trade-offs, and you're going to have to ask yourself at times whether a particular investment fits with that purpose. And if it doesn't, and you want to sort of stick to the purpose, then you have to make those difficult decisions and potentially sell that investment. So yeah, it's not always easy, but I think you have to have that focus to ensure that you're delivering on it.
And that was a brilliant position. Now, we've not got a huge amount of time left, and I'm really keen to sort of move the conversation on to sort of get your take on where we are, if you like, with corporate purpose, and perhaps some reflections on the origins and where we've got to at this point, because I know you think we're in a particularly interesting moment, if you like.
Yeah.
Just give our listeners and viewers a flavour of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, I'm a bit of a nerd, and I sort of did a little bit of reading in the history books, just to think about what the origins of purpose were and where it's going. So this is sort of my take on it, and please don't for 1 minute think this is this gospel. And as with anything in history, it's never perfectly linear, but I'm going to attempt to try and make it so. So has lots of flaws in my description here. But if you turn the clock back 50 years, I think purpose was first started to talk about in the US, and there was a particularly famous economist called Milton Friedman, He was from this sort of Chicago School of Economics. He was a Nobel Prize winner, and he developed the sort of the first thoughts around the sort of free market economy and deregulation. And very famously, he wrote this essay, which was published in the New York Times, where he declared that the only social responsibility of a business was to increase profits. And that sort of doctrine, that theory, really influenced the sort of the next phase, which was leading into the 1980s, which is a sort of phase of sort of free market capitalism, where particularly, you had Thatcher and Reagan, who were very, very heavily deregulatory and created a very sort of free market approach to business and to the economy. And if you look back in sort of popular culture, the image that probably we have of that era is from the film Wall Street, the Oliver Stone film Wall Street, where you've got Gordon Gekko with his sort of red braces declaring that greed was good. And, that's probably the most extreme example of that. But interestingly, when that film was made, it was in the late 1980s, and the tide was just starting to change. And, that film also has some lessons in there about when you take that sort of free market economy and economic approach too far. And that leads you into the sort of what I describe as the next phase, which is one of responsible capitalism, where the green movement was starting to take shape, and you had key figures like Anita Roddick, founder of the Body Shop, who became sort of emblematic of this new movement around the environment. And then that takes us to what is probably the current era, which is around sort of stakeholder capitalism. And there was a big movement, I think it was in 2019, where 180 CEOs, mainly from the US, but some global CEOs, signed this statement to say that the purpose of business was not just to serve shareholders, it was to serve employees, communities, suppliers, and take a more long-term approach. And some of the key figures in this era were people like Paul Pullman of Unilever and Professor Colin Mayer of the University of Oxford. And this is a sort of the era that we've currently been in, where people are talking about purpose, serving people, planet, and profit. But I do wonder, Charlie, whether we're sort of now exiting that era and we're entering a new phase, which I could give a few thoughts to. But before I do, any sort of reflections on that at all?
Well, I think, Clayton, we're all tantalizingly waiting for you to get your crystal ball out to tell us what's going to happen next, because you brilliantly described those kind of three key phases, if you like, and the fact that we've almost, I mean, I'm questioning whether or not we're going to be coming back full circle or not. But please do tell us what you're thinking is going to happen next.
If I knew, I would be a very rich man. But what I'm sort of observing, I'm sure we're all observing, is a number of different directions that purpose is going in. So I think the first, you've got a bunch of companies that are sticking to the guns or doubling down on purpose. And these are companies where purpose is embedded in their strategy, but also they see purpose as a business opportunity. And they're pursuing those business opportunities quite aggressively in a positive way. But I think also what we're seeing is, and I'm sure you'll be familiar with this, that there's a certain degree of what you might describe as green hushing, that some of the companies are doing it. They're very purposeful, but they don't necessarily want to blow the trumpet too loudly at the moment for fear of political backlash, shall we say. So that's one group of companies where, they're sticking to the purpose, it's working for them, and they're sort of doubling down on it. I think the second category are a number of companies who are still got a purpose, but they're perhaps rowing back from that purpose they developed in the sort of heady days of, the post-COVID heady days. For example, BP, back in, I think, February 2020, the former CEO, Bernard Looney, really shifted the strategy of BP and the purpose of BP. He came up with this slogan, reimagining energy for people and our planet. But that lasted only a couple of years, and BP's new strategy is to sort of go perhaps back to the core and thinking about oil and gas as a sort of the core focus of the business. And its new purpose is to deliver energy to the world today and tomorrow. So that's much more about resilience rather than sort of shifting to greener forms of energy. And I think then the third category is companies where they developed a purpose because it was fashionable and trendy and they wanted a nice slogan on their website. And they effectively dropped them because it was just fairly vacuous, inauthentic, and they've dropped their purpose because it didn't serve any marketing benefit anymore. And I'm being a bit cynical, but there were a lot of companies that developed a purpose that was little more than marketing at the time, and they've sort of quietly now been dropped. So where all that takes us, I don't know, but that's kind of my observation of what seems to be happening at the moment in the world of corporate purpose.
And brilliantly described, Clayton. And I think I'm sort of left with that reflection with a slight sort of sense of fear, if I'm honest, about what might happen next. Because as you say, it feels like, the world is becoming more and more polarized in many ways, and it's almost like, as you've alluded to there, that we're becoming polarized in the sense of the way that or the views around corporate purpose. You've got the backlash, if you like, for those, and those that are leaning in more strongly into it. Yeah. How, again, getting your crystal ball out here and appreciating that you're sharing this with our audience, but what are going to be the things that you think will affect sort of what the world of corporate purpose looks like in the next 5 to 10 years? Like what is going to win out, do you think? Do you think those that really do lean in at this stage and sort of double down, as you've alluded to, or do you think we're going to end up reflecting on this as a very nice a period where a lot of niceties were thrown around, a lot of marketing was thrown around, but the reality of the circumstances that we find ourselves in a corporate world were sort of not fully factored in? What do you think will happen?
Well, I think the driving force will be, to a certain degree, shareholders. And the reason why the whole ESG movement took off is that shareholders wanted to have a very clear way of measuring companies' purpose or companies' impact. We know that it's, to a certain degree, that's flawed, but at least it's a way of measuring it. So that shareholders, to a certain degree, were a driving force behind purpose in the halcyon days. And I think they will still have an influence over companies, positively or negatively, but that depends on whether they're thinking of a long term or short term. As to what will win out, I think what will win out is companies that recognize that there is a premium in solving some of these big challenges of people and planet. And I saw reported last week that HSBC, for example, has significantly increased the investment it's making in renewable energy because it sees that as a business opportunity. Or there's another example I saw, Bayer, the German pharmaceutical company, is investing heavily in future of agriculture and how the crops will be grown that will be more climate tolerant. So that's, I think, where it will win out, where companies recognize that there is an opportunity to develop business in areas that are sort of long term, but also support some of the changes that are happening to the planet. And I think to go sort of full circle and go back to sort of where we started on the comms side of things, I think one of the problems with purpose is that it did get massively overhyped by the industry I'm in and the industry you're in. And there were lots of comms people who got slightly ahead of themselves and really sort of taking purpose and making claims that couldn't be substantiated. And that's why we've got this sort of whole sort of pantheon of different terms for different ways of spinning purpose, greenwashing, purpose washing, green hushing, green lighting, green rinsing. The very fact that all these terms exist shows that as an industry, we weren't always being 100% authentic about what we were describing when it came to sort of purpose and what the business was actually doing.
What do you, on that point then, because I think it's a fascinating point, what do you see the future of kind of, how do you see sustainability communications, let's call it that, kind of evolving and adapting, and how do you see it playing out, if you like, as we move forward into this new era of, mandated authenticity, if you want to call it that, in terms of the way that we present ourselves? What changes do you see occurring?
I'd love to be able to give you a clear answer. I just don't know. I think we're at too early a stage. I'd like to think there was going to be much more authenticity in the in sort of communications and what companies are disclosing. But again, I think it will be driven to a certain degree by shareholders and what shareholders want and what the companies want to disclose to their shareholders. But I'm going to be slightly naughty and throw it back to you, Charlie, to have a discussion about it. But what's your take on that?
Yeah, I think you use the BP example. I think that's a fascinating way of framing things, and you've actually alluded to the time framing of things, I think, which is crucial. Mm-hmm. I think in order to be authentic about your position, about your purpose, and therefore for your communications to line up, it's got to be long term. You can't be flitting from one position to the next, depending upon who happens to be, in charge of the company, or who happens to, an evolving mandate, if you like, from your stakeholders. You've got to stick to your position. And I think that's the crucial thing that plays out, not just in terms of corporate purpose, but then has that knock-on impact in terms of communications. I think we're going to become really unforgiving, I think, as a society, for organizations that choose to position themselves in one way and then just very quickly, it seems, choose another. So that's, again, I haven't got my crystal ball out. I threw that on you, but that would be my guess.
And I think though it's a really interesting thought. I just wonder though whether consumers and citizens are really that unforgiving, or whether they've got short-term memories and sort of slightly forget when companies are flip-flopping a little bit on this. So that would be my worry. But I love your optimism, Charlie, that companies will be punished if they are being inauthentic when it comes to that purpose.
Well, but you make a very, very good point, Clayton. And I hadn't, so I'd given more credit to the long term, or the historical thinking that goes on when it relates to the brands that we engage with. But anyway, that was an absolutely fascinating take. We've obliterated our time zone. My producer's going to have a right go at me. But let's conclude now with my final question, Clayton. If I was to hand you a magic wand and you could change one thing about the commercial world this instant, what would that one thing be?
Well, I think we've touched on it. I'm going to be a bit naughty and say two. So one is be long-term. I think companies that are thinking long-term, planning long-term, investing for the long-term, they deliver such a stronger benefit. So I think that's number one. And number two, it's just being super authentic with the messages and the communications. As I say, the very fact that there's a whole set of words out there to describe companies that are being inauthentic in what they're saying demonstrates that there is a real need for that sort of more authentic comms and radical sort of transparency about what they're doing.
Well, I give out hears for those guests that I think suggest things that are absolutely on point and aligned with our own thinking. So you very much get a hear here, Clayton. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. That was absolutely brilliant. Thank you for coming on.
Absolute pleasure, Charlie. Really good. Thank you.
And that's it for today's episode of The Responsible Edge. A big, big thank you to Clayton Hirst, most recently former Director of Corporate Affairs at Halma PLC, for joining us. In this episode, we unpacked insights from Brent Gleason's Forbes article exploring why companies with a clear mission outperform their peers, from driving innovation and retaining talent to weathering economic turbulence with resilience and vision. As a reminder, this episode was brought to you by the Anti-Greenwash Charter, championing responsible sustainability communications. Visit antigreenwashcharter.com to learn more. I'm Charlie Martin. Thanks for listening. And don't forget to subscribe, share, and leave us a review. See you next time.